So Docker itself has a lot of key uses, and I'm just going to kind of talk about this as you guys get all set up. But basically, what you can use it for is, so Docker container and a Docker image, what it does is it takes your code and all your dependencies and everything it needs, and it sticks it all into a container to containerize it. So whenever you do any installs or anything like that, that image you have will be consistent from there. So you can pass that image to different machines and it would run the same way. Whereas if it required local settings on your computer and then you gave it to someone else with different computer settings, it would not work. And so some examples they give for use cases is to configure for a pipeline for when you want to pass images around to different machines for testing. More productive when you have to share. You can make an app that works by itself. So one huge use case it's used for is microservices. You can put the entire app within a Docker container, and you can specify what interface it has. So then you can have this service, this service, this service, and they're all just talking to each other as part of one larger service. And they're much easier to debug as well when you have everything kind of separated out like that. Yeah. And more specific to AWS is they offer something called ECS, Elastic Container Service. What this will do is on an EC2 instance, which is a little server instance they give you, they'll just run a container or run an image, which makes it a lot easier because you don't have to configure your server with any settings or anything. It'll just run that container with everything it has. It makes it a lot easier to scale backward and forward because all you need to do is run a container, not do any of that setup. And you'll know it will work on all the server instances even if they're slightly different. So for this tutorial, we're actually going to set up a small Nginx server. Nginx can be used, we're going to set it up as a web server, but can also be used to load balance and route traffic. Pretty much any kind of use case you would have for a server, you can set up Nginx to do. Yeah, here are some companies that use it. So we're going to do Nginx on Docker. So right now, here's my terminal. And here, how many people have Docker installed now? Nice. 3 people? Yeah? What? Still process? Yeah. Yeah. We'll get started, and then at the end, we'll circle back, and of course this is being screencast right now, so this will be on the website. So once you have Docker installed, to do a little test, you can do docker run hello world. This is just kind of a welcome message. Initially, before you've run this before, it'll probably say you don't have that image locally, and then it will pull the image. After that point, you can run this again, and you'll get this output. Images it pulls like that are all its official images, and we'll see an example of one of those a little bit later. But once you know that it's good to go, you can do docker pull Nginx. For me, I already have it, so it looked for it and said I already have the latest version. For you guys, you'll likely have to it'll kind of pull it in, similar to how it pulled in the Hello World image. And we can actually now take a look at what Nginx is. So this right here is what it pulled in. An image that has this. So what this is a Docker file. And so what's going is it's saying, all right, we're going to use the Ubuntu Docker file as the base for what this is. And that's what the from specifies. And you can write your own Docker files. That's not something we'll get into for this session, but it's very powerful. And for the pattern I use to upload things to AWS, I have a Docker file written, which I'll show you guys at the end. Run does kind of what you expect. It will run all these commands. Volumes specify, with Docker, one thing you can do is mount a volume, which means you say, whenever I run this, I'll specify volumes to mount in, and I'll have access to those files. And by setting it here, you can specify what the mount points are. Workdir, this just says whenever anything's run, where it will be run from by default. Command, CMD, this means as soon as it's run, the first thing it does, as soon as it's open, it runs the Nginx command. And then exposed ports allows you to talk to it through these ports. Port 80 is the default web port. And we'll actually be using that to run Nginx locally on our machines. Alright, so now that we have Nginx in the image, let's do something with it. So in order to run an image, you would do kind of like Docker run, how I showed with the hello world, but this time we'll give it a name. So -- name, we'll give it, and let's pick the name Docker Nginx. This will mean that the container we make with this will have that name, Docker Nginx. And then Nginx here. Now if we run this here, this won't look nice. As you can see, right now it's running, which is not helpful because now we can't do anything else. So let's have it run in the background. First thing I'll do is I'll make sure I have it removed. This will just force remove this image if it exists. Because we're giving it a specific name, we'll have to do this each time. You don't have to give it a name. Docker will actually give it an ID, and we'll actually see what a Docker ID looks like later on. But now let's run it in something called detached mode. So -D will run this in detached mode, which will just allow you to do other stuff. And while it's in detached mode, you see here, this is the unique Docker ID for this instance right here. So the running of this instance. And if we do Docker PS, Docker PS shows all the running processes you have. And right now I have Nginx running. The container ID is just a start of the full image ID. And we see right now is being exposed port 80 and TCP, the 443. So now let's remove it. And if we do Docker PS again, we don't have anything running. So now let's make it actually do something useful. Now, instead of just running in detached mode, we're going to expose port 80. So what this is doing is it's saying, I want port 80 from my machine to just display whatever is coming out of port 80 from the Nginx Docker container. So now if we run this and we go to a web browser for your local host, and localhost is just, Localhost is just your IP address for your local machine. And by default, it's port 80. If we want to, we can actually specify which port 80. And you should see this. Welcome to Nginx. This is their default screen that they kind of show based on how they have it configured. So we actually have it running. And if we remove this container and then refresh, it's gone. We've just killed it. So there we actually, in very few steps, had a very simple Nginx up and running. Now I'm going to show you how to play with it a little bit. Just kind of a couple tweaks. So I will run it again. And here's one use case you can use this ID for. Yeah, of course.
So what's the first 80 and the second 80, what does that mean?
Yeah. So the first 80 means I am going to expose, I'm going to give it access to port 80 on my machine. Yep, on your computer. The second 80 is it's going to be from port 80 within the Docker container. So if you see here, right here, they exposed port 80 for Nginx. And so when they run Nginx, they're actually pushing data through port 80. And then here we're saying, okay, any data pushed through port 80 from this container, I'll push through my port 80 as well. But yeah, that's a good question. So with running with this ID, one interesting thing you can do is if you don't specify a name, for example, you can have multiple of these running at the same time. And you can actually access the file system of these. So from here, let's do docker copy. And so what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to copy from this container what is at etc-nginx-conf.d. What this is the config directory for the Nginx server. And I'm going to copy that from this container here to my local machine where I am right now. You can copy from one Docker container to another just by specifying this ID for the two. So after we do this, we'll have the conf.d, that configuration directory. And let's go in there. They have their default. Let's actually edit it. So we'll take a look at a little bit of this. This is specifying a server. The server is listing on port 80, and it'll be through the local host. This is pretty complicated, what you can do with this. I honestly don't know all the things you can do with it. It's very powerful. But one thing we're going to change is, just to show a change later, we're going to change this root location for the file. But let's do something else first. So now that we're able to run it and expose ports, let's actually add files to this as well. So if you see where I am now, I am in the directory that has all the files for the website, the UMN Cloud website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this, but I'm also going to give this Docker container access to where we are right now. And user share, let's just do HTML. So what this is doing right here is it is saying these files right here, and what the backtick, pwd backtick is doing is it's just running the print working directory command, which I'll just show it here, print working directory. it just shows where you are in the file system. So what this is basically doing is saying all the files right here, give all these files and put them right here in this directory of the container itself. So now if we run this, can go here, it's running again, but like this right here, there's nothing. No kind of change really at all. None that we can see. Because the config for the Nginx runs on very specific files, and we just kind of threw this here, and it's not being used anywhere. So if we go to here and we edit the config, let's change this location. So we're going to still load in the index.html. That's just kind of the default that things do. But the root now will be where we put our files. Share-html. So now instead of loading the default page from here, it'll load our website where we put it here. So save this. And now, if we want this to be the config, we have to put this in as well. So let's do -v, and this is actually in my home-code directory. Yep. And I'll put this as, and we can see here, this is what it uses for its configuration. So we're going to put it there. Nginx. Alright, nice. And when I run this, we should get an error. And that's because we have one thing running right now, and with this name, and we can't run two things with the same name. Here's the example. It's having a conflict. So first we'll do the docker remove, and then we'll do this change. Alright, so now that we've done this change, let's see how it impacts the page, localhost. And because we specified this to be the root directory now our localhost is actually displaying all this, all here, all the pages. This is all just now running from within that Docker container itself. It is running this all as its own server. So this is just a simple use case you can use for Nginx and Docker itself. For example, if you wanted to use Django with Python to make a server, you can put that all within a Docker container that can run Python, and then expose port 80 using this similar syntax, and then you can run that site within the container, and you can just access it here. And if we expose a different ports, for example, let's expose here instead of port 80. Let's do 90. So here, there isn't anything. But if we go to localhost 90, it's displayed here. So you can have multiple things running at the same time and just give them different ports here, and you can access them all just from within any of your browsers locally. And that's one thing I've seen Docker used for a lot, is you can give your code a nice UI, a nice interface, by just having it be through a web browser. That's really easy to kind of set things up in. Yeah, so this is one way and a couple of commands and tools for running Docker itself. Let's remove this container. Refresh. And we've killed it. Yeah, and if you're interested, there are a lot of different configurations you can set for Nginx specifically. And now let's take a quick look at, for the final portion, let's take a quick look at a Docker file that I have written for my deployment system. So let's go to, it's called bash pattern. So this is just a small Docker file I wrote to run the AWS commands. Just from the Ubuntu, do a couple of installations needed, and then it's good to go. So whenever I want to run AWS commands, I can do it within this container without impacting the rest of the system.